this year's, the 2025 installment of the Herencia lectures. We are very excited to welcome all of you. We are very excited for the people who, some coming from afar, to be here. Not just you, Dr. Nicolás Panotto, coming from, well, now coming from Germany this time, but we're very grateful for all of you to be here. Thank you, Dr. Heather Miller-Rubens. And thank you to Dr. Claudio Carvajales for an excellent sermon this over there, back there. The Herencia lectures, believe it or not, I was in the first meeting when this was like starting. I was just a student, and it was just some seeds were being planted on what can we bring to this to the seminary community to highlight the contributions or the work that is happening not just in the Latin American church in the United States, but all in the global South, right? And a lot has happened since 2009. A lot of things. It feels like a whole different world from when I was a student here. And the first lecturer was Dr. Ada Maria Isasis, was the first lecturer for that conference. And we've had Raimundo, you've been here more for this, but we have Dr. Miguel de la Torre, David Aponte. We have had many theologians, important theologians, and that's the idea is to bring them here so that we can learn from them and learn and share with the community the great contributions that that Latin American theologians are doing, and also the conversations that we're having across with other groups in the United States. And one of the things that I remember that was very interesting for me when I heard Ada Maria Isasis, it was saying that one of the criticisms that she has of the academy is like, I'm trying to remember it. She was saying, they always put out in the academy Latin American theologians for whatever reason. And then she said, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not a good or great theology that we're doing. And that was very, very powerful for me when I heard it. That the great impact that our community is doing, also the conversations that we are having across the intersectionalities with other groups in the United States. So this time, we are going to be talking about the life of who is known, who is the first American Pope. Yes, the first American Pope, okay, who is from Latin America. And as I was saying in a class that I was invited to get speak, even the term Latin America is a term that is being imposed on us. We do not choose to be Latin Americans. The dominant culture, they're the ones calling us Latinos. When I walked in here for the first time, I refused to be called Latin American. I am Puerto Riqueño. I am a Boricua. Mexicanos. And sometimes they put us in this whole group as Latin Americans because it's easier, because it's the easiest thing to do. And for you to know that I am Puerto Riqueño or a Mexicano or a Cubano, that means that you need to take time to know me. And it's easier to just say Latinos. Oops, sorry. Latinos. Latinos. But we are more than that. You know, this is, so he is the first American Pope. Because America, all the way from Alaska, all the way Argentina, right? And we have two great scholars who are here. And our first lecture is going to be by Dr. Heather Miller-Rubens. And she is the executive director and Roman Catholic scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be here, Reverend Dr. Arroyo. This is just a real honor to be with the Princeton Seminary community and to be in conversation with Dr. Panotto and Reverend Dr. Calares. So thank you for the opportunity to do so. So I identify as a Roman Catholic scholar practitioner of interreligious dialogue, working at an independent academic nonprofit in Baltimore, Maryland. Tonight I'm focusing my remarks on Pope Francis's papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti and his call to create cultures of encounter with all people of goodwill as part of the unfolding legacy of Nostra Aetate, which is the church teaching issued in 1965 and is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, to open up the church to interreligious and interfaith relations. So I'm going to do this by focusing on three key terms. There we go. I've started my timer because I also have 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to stick to that. Three key terms critical to the document. Though these terms are not defined nor treated systematically in the document. I'm hoping to spark group conversation. I'm going to hazard how I think Francis is using them interrelatedly and sort of how they're showing up in the encyclical. And so in the first part, I'm going to talk about fraternity and family. Again, fratelli tutti, sort of all is family. Specifically, what does it mean to think of humans, all humans, as brothers and sisters, as a theological foundation for interfaith encounter? Second, I'm going to briefly discuss friendship as an important aim of this encounter, the sort of telos. And finally, I want to conclude by thinking about interreligious dialogue as method. And I'm going to try my best to keep it to 15 minutes. In so many ways, I feel like I'm doing a lot of gesturing in this as opposed to sort of arguing, and so we can go deeper later. All right. So on October 3rd, 2020, while the world struggled with death, illness, and profound loneliness because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Pope Francis signed and issued his third papal encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, an appeal to the whole human family to build friendships and increase human connection. Pope Francis called for all people of goodwill to create and sustain cultures of encounter, grounded in the dignity of each person, and realized through the practices of dialogue. To support such a project, religious leaders and theologians must develop theologies and practices that center encounter and dialogue amidst the whole human family. So this is the first major papal document to arise from an interreligious friendship and to embrace both de facto religious pluralism as the context for Catholic theological reflection and dialogue as the primary theological response to religious diversity in the world. Indeed, this encyclical developed out of the interreligious dialogue and growing friendship between Pope Francis and Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, Ahmed Al-Tayeb. In 2019, Pope Francis and Imam Al-Tayeb issued a joint statement entitled Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, which, quote, is a document that invites all persons who have faith in God and faith in human fraternity to unite and work together so that they may serve as a guide for future generations to advance a culture of respect and awareness of the great divine grace that makes all human beings brothers and sisters. We'll get back to that document later. Lastly, I want to lift up something that Pim Valkenburg observed, that in the middle of the pandemic, Francis chose to go and sign Fratelli Tutti and issue it from Assisi and not from Rome. And thinking about symbolic gestures, I think that this is an important one. He was at the tomb of St. Francis on the vigil eve of his feast day to issue Fratelli Tutti. And I think that this shows how Francis thinks dialogues should begin and where they should begin. Not at the center of power, not in the Vatican, not in Rome, but in Assisi. So a few things about the document on human fraternity, and there's a photo from the signing, again from 2019. The framework suggested for creating a culture of encounter is one of mutuality, respect, dialogue, and cooperation on shared concerns and problems. Importantly, for both Pope Francis and Imam al-Tayyib, it is critical to make this theological political claim that equal rights for all is not done only in a secularized humanitarian framework, but is grounded in God's will. Because everyone is a child of God, all humans are brothers and sisters. We are family, living in a shared home, our planet Earth. There's also the positionality for Laudato Si, which was referenced earlier. With that theological starting point that we are all family, there then follows some family rules. We must dialogue, we must cooperate, and try to understand one another. Thus, interreligious encounters that aim towards reciprocity and mutuality in both knowledge and cooperation must not only be encouraged, but Catholics and all people of goodwill are called to actively seek out such opportunities. Collaborative and cooperative efforts that promote human flourishing and care for creation are doing God's will. With this renewed focus on human connections and interreligious friendships, Pope Francis invites Catholic scholars to develop cultures of encounter to support this dialogue and reciprocity. I think it's important to mention that while this was born of a specific Christian-Muslim dialogue, it's not limited to the Christian-Muslim communities, but a call for universal cooperation. All right, so I want to stop here for a second, because here's the sort of big question I want to follow through for the rest of the night. How should Christians think about their relationships with religious others? What are the metaphors and the frameworks and imaginations that we could use to capture interfaith relations and to develop theologies of encounter? And then vice versa, again, that reciprocity, how could or should non-Christians think about Christians and Christianity? There are, of course, many options in this space. As a Christian, we could start with Paul in Romans 11, right, where you've got the sort of horticultural metaphors of olive branches and roots and grafting. And of course, we have furniture metaphors. The dialogue table is a ubiquitous thing that I talk about a lot. There are mealtime metaphors. Ibu Patel at Interfaith America likes to talk about us as a potluck nation. So we've got shrubs, we've got tables, we've got food. These metaphors are, I think, insufficient for capturing the dynamics of human-human encounter, of human-human relationships. And I think Francis knows this. The sort of interpersonal and intercommunal connections that he's striving for don't really get captured by those metaphors. That sort of the grasping for sustained relationality in all of its possibility and in all of its messiness. And Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis demonstrates his desire and interest in centering the human to human, the theological work needed to create sustainable cultures of encounter between peoples, to cultivate compassion and to trust one another, and to find metaphors that can hold depth and can hold intimacy, images and ideas that can hold on to passion and betrayal and affection and envy, pain and desire. Friends and family can get into those places and spaces. And Fratelli Tutti, I think Pope Francis chooses to use the language of family and the language of friendship to characterize and ground interfaith relations for this reason. He doesn't offer tidy definitions of either, and sometimes they're used interchangeably and sometimes in tandem when he's trying to make a point. Both terms, though, have a rich and varied theological and religious tradition around them. There are also terms that are deeply rooted in many different religious traditions, family and friends. Generally, almost everybody has something to say about that, as well as the interdisciplinary possibilities of thinking about diverse projects in the humanities, which also could give insight into this space. So these are metaphors and concepts to which diverse imaginaries have the capacity to co-develop. And of course, this work has been begun by Jason Welly, who's up at Boston College now, you may be familiar with. He's done a more exhaustive sense of how specifically family and brotherhood metaphors have been used across Francis's papacy, and I'm really indebted to his work. So moving ahead for the family terms, Fraternity and kinship has been a signature part of Pope Francis's papacy, grounded in St. Francis of Assisi's expansive vision of interconnectedness and creation. So I don't know if you know the Canticle of Creation from St. Francis, where he talks about brother sun and sister moon and all of that. Again, the family metaphors are so present. As dehumanization and denigration and indifference drive humans apart from one another, searching for ways to affirm the dignity of every human person, as well as our intimate and innate interconnectedness, is part of Francis's goal. In Fratelli Tutti, I read Pope Francis's understanding of fraternity and family to be the theological foundation upon which he calls us to build cultures of encounter. So looking specifically at paragraph 8 in the document, it's clear that Pope Francis thinks we need to anchor claims to human rights and human equality with a theological foundation. And for both him and Imam el-Tayyib, a purely secularized human rights framework is insufficient. Brothers and sisters all, this is how he ends this section here. So in this phrasing, Pope Francis indicates that we can contribute to the rebirth of this aspiration to universal fraternity. And he knows that we have lost or forgotten this theological claim as a foundational hope. Indeed, he uses kinship throughout this document, but he's also aware that kinship does not necessarily indicate a healthy relationship. Families can be dysfunctional, abusive, even murderous. Pope Francis turns to the parable of the Good Samaritan and specifically uses the story of Cain and Abel to show the extremes of what can go wrong. This is the only Cain and Abel reference in this part. But he lingers there because he says the question at the end, am I my brother's keeper, is the essential question, is the question that he wants to take from this with an awareness that this is not a metaphor that doesn't also have its problems. So if we say yes to this question, am I my brother's keeper, and we expand the notion of family and kinship to include all of humanity, what comes next? In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis says we must engage in dialogues that aim to create friendship, right? So that's the telos, that's the next thing along the way. What happens to the theology of Catholic thinkers who have close interreligious friendships and value interreligious dialogue as key to their theological method? What happens when the beliefs of the Catholic laity who befriend neighbors of different faiths inflect their understanding of the world and their own religiosity? Nearly 60 years after the Second Vatican Council, answers to these questions are still emerging. Catholic theologians and religious leaders have been engaging in interreligious dialogue at the highest levels of scholarly expertise and clerical leadership. And at the same time, the Catholic laity regularly dialogues with neighbors in the world. With Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis builds upon this important legacy from the Second Vatican Council, prioritizing dialogues that create and sustain the cultures of encounter he wants to build. He does so by revitalizing the sort of fourfold framework for dialogue first put out by the Vatican in 1991, engaging all folks to engage in this task. So the four dialogues, it's the dialogue of life, the dialogue of action, the dialogue of theological exchange, and the dialogue of religious experience. And in Fratelli Tutti, he's really focused on the dialogues of life and the dialogues of action as critical to sustaining theologies of encounter and addressing the ills of our world in this current moment. I think the COVID-19 pandemic, again, the context when this was initially sent out into the world, reminded Pope Francis and really the whole human family of our fragility and our interconnectedness. In the wake of this global trauma, those who care about the theological legacy of Nostra Aetate can see the continued urgency of this work to build resilient interreligious friendships. Indeed, as the pandemic so forcefully reminded us, our lives are at stake if we don't. Interreligious friendship was not an abstraction for Pope Francis. Indeed, in my world of interfaith relations, one of the first stories that struck when he was elected in 2013 was that he had a close rabbi from Argentina named Abraham Skorka, who was not only a colleague, not only a clergy peer, but a real friend. This is Rabbi Skorka's statement upon the death of Pope Francis earlier this year. You can see that the new pope, his reflections on this, had called him when he was elected, gave him his email so that they could get in touch. There was a sense of equality, of mutuality, of disagreement, of silences in their friendship. This is a friendship that grew from the 1990s until Pope Francis's death. It is a kind of interreligious intimacy that was new with Pope Francis's pontificate. And I think that Pope Francis understood the necessity of highlighting the fact that this interreligious friendship impacted his theology and in his praxis. And he invited us all to imagine a church and a world where that was true for more people. All right, so while we may start as family, as the theological foundation, brothers and sisters all, Pope Francis is encouraging people to pursue friendships that cross boundaries and to see those friendships as a place for theological thinking. So this is not a sort of, it's related to mission theology and mission theology fields, but it really is this theology of encounter grounded in this particular vision. In 1965, at the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate offered the Catholic Church an invitation to pursue a new way of engaging with Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and other men and women of goodwill. This invitation to interreligious dialogue and encounter had profound implications for Catholic theology, from the study of sacred text to liturgy, because it was an invitation for the Church to listen, to hear God in the voices, practices, and examples of our interfaith neighbors. And listening, this really listening to your longtime friend, it changes the listener. So here's another section from Friendship from paragraph 43. Throughout the whole of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis is cognizant of online culture and the sort of fast-paced quest for instant gratification. Creating cultures of encounter, he highlights, is slow work, and that requires patience and fortitude and commitment. To have a friend is to be invested in someone's life and flourishing, and in turn have them invested in yours. So how do we do this? How do we get from family to hopefully friends? He has a huge sections on dialogue here. Pope Francis spends a great deal of time in this document exploring how he defines dialogue, which attends to power relationships, intentionality, and to commitment. So I'm recognizing I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Briefly, at the end of the day, in a culture of dehumanization, I think dialogue for Francis is a rehumanizing activity. To approach, to speak, to listen, to look at, it's a full sensory experience. It's not flashy work, it's slow work, and it's interpersonal, the deeply human way that we can better relate to one another. So to sum up at the end, back to the beginning, the metaphors of fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood, and friendship loom large in this whole document, and I'm wondering what we think of these. Is there capacity here for further reflection? Is this a sort of unique feature for Pope Francis that we would want to take forward? What are the problems with these metaphors? What other things do they open up for us? How can we imagine interreligious relationships? Again, that capaciousness of Pope Francis. And how has he modeled doing this theological reflection for us? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miller-Rubens. Now we welcome Dr. Nicolás Panotto. He's an Argentinian resident in Chile, but he's coming from Germany because he's doing some work there right now. Oh, sorry.
No, you're
Okay. I want to mention that both Dr. Heather Miller-Rubens and Dr. Nicolás Panotto, they have been visiting scholars here at Princeton Theological Seminary in the past couple of years. So they're not new to our community, and they have deep friendships in this community as well. Like I said, he's a resident, an Argentinian resident in Chile, theologian and PhD in social sciences, postdoctoral researcher, and at the National Research and Development Agency of Chile, and the founder and director of Otros Cruces, which is an organization focused on training and advocacy with civil society on issues related to the public place of religions. So, welcome, Dr. Panotto.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you again, actually in this same room. The last time, some of you suffer of some of my class. Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. The title of my presentation is "The People, a Political and Theological Locus: Pope Francis' Perspective on the Popular Space of Revelation." And I must begin this presentation with a confession. When hearing the name of Jorge Bergoglio announced as the elected Pope in 2013 conclave, I experienced mixed, even contradictory feelings as a first reaction. It was a particular moment in my country. These were the years in which debates on same-sex marriage and other inclusive policies began to emerge in public discussion, as well as the recovery of memory-based policies to confront the still unsolved effects of the dictatorship in Argentina. The Argentine Catholic Church was a visible actor in this process, given the complex historical relationship with the last military dictatorship. At the same time, the Church became one of the most resistant voices against the advancement on inclusive policies. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Bergoglio played a crucial role in this context. He was called, actually, on several occasions to testify in cases involving the Church and his participation in the disappearances during the dictatorship, a time where he played a central role as one of the principal leaders in the Jesuits in that time. He was also a prominent spokesperson for the ecclesial position opposing, actually, same-sex marriage. With this in mind, it was difficult for me, at least, to see Bergoglio as someone who could become a critical figure of the ecclesiastical structure. However, there are other aspects of his work that also deserve to be mentioned. He promoted interreligious dialogue with the leading national institutions in the country, enabled the opening of the church archives during the time of dictatorship, led efforts to limit the influence of integralist and fundamentalist Catholic expressions such as the Opus Dei, a task that he later expanded from the Vatican, and was actively committed to pastoral work within the poorest sectors of the city of Buenos Aires, a practice he encouraged among the seminarians under his leadership. We could add other milestones, such as his decisive role in the 5th General Conference of the Latin American Episcopate in Aparecida in 2007, where his intervention proved essential from bringing opposing positions closer together and achieving a basic consensus. To all of this, we must add his very renowned austere lifestyles, as well as his significant gestures he had against the elitist and some privileged practice that characterized some of the ecclesiastical structure. In summary, the figure of Bergoglio appears, in a certain sense, paradoxical. It is difficult to encapsulate him within a single category. His figure moves between institutional functionality and criticism to its rigidity, between a defensive reaction from dogma and a subversive loyalty in responding to social demands that exceed theological tradition. This is evident in the variety of labels he received from theological, ecclesial, and political sectors. He was named as communist and leftist because of his critiques of capitalism and the market, as well as because of his gestures toward the LGBTQ+ community. Yet, he was also judged as conservative for not moving beyond certain gestures toward deeper institutional and doctrinal reforms. Some define him as a liberation theologian, and others as the theologian of the church social doctrine. Regardless these labels, there was a generalized consensus on one point. his emphasis on the people. And this is precisely here when that this ambiguity or paradox surrounding his figure acquires another meaning. What may be seen like an ambivalence or a contradiction responds instead to a logic aimed at addressing the complexity of the social dynamics of the popular. People becomes, for Francis, a category that is simultaneously theological and sociopolitical, which, far from attempting to define an essence, makes it possible to frame and articulate a plurality of voices, practices, narrative, theological and ideological perspective that may even appear antagonistic, but which, rephrasing the philosopher Ernesto Laclau, shape articulatory positions that transform difference and plurality into a field of possibility for generating shared ethical and social horizons. What I would like to propose is that one of Pope Francis' central legacies is his notion of the people, which contributed to deepen the Second Vatican Council's understanding of the Church as the people of God, enriched in this case by specific Latin American theological traditions, particularly the so-called theology of the people. Above all, however, I identify in this proposal what we could call an ethic of solidarity, which conceives the people as a theological subject through the articulation of shared horizons. It is not a notion of people defined it is a notion of people defined by God's initiative in history, orientated toward building an eschatological community, one sustained by hope, a fraternal community understood as a community of love, and created from a radical openness to the other, grounded in the loving alterity of God. Although we lack the time to develop it fully, Francis' understanding of the popular is rooted in a historically grounded spirituality structured around what I identify as three key dimensions. The first one is that it is a spirituality founded on compassion as divine language. That is a concept he usually used. Understood as a force for action that invites commitment to others as the starting point of faith. Second, it promotes a spirituality critical to those structures that hinder the creation of a space of compassion. This is evident, for example, in the four well-known prophetic noun within the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. No to an economy of exclusion. No to the new idolatry of money. No to the financial system which rules rather than serves. No to the inequality which seeds violence. And third, Francis fosters a spirituality that recognizes plurality as a theological space of revelation. On various occasions, he affirmed the possibility of encountering the divine in each person, even beyond the Christian faith and the Church itself. This appreciation for plurality was evident in various initiatives during his pontificate, such as the outreach of the youth and all the activities he made around the world with the youth, the Synod of Pan-Amazon region and the establishment of an intercultural pastoral dialogue with indigenous groups, as well as the synodal process he initiated and which remains ongoing. This understanding of spirituality as a form of solidarity-based participation in the world and as a theological appreciation of plurality must be related with the influence of the theology of the people on Francis. In 1983, Juan Carlos Escanone, a Jesuit theologian from Argentina and that was one of Bergoglio's professors, proposed four models of liberation theology. The Chalcedonian model, which addresses the union of divinity and humanity in Christ, the sacramental model, which focuses on the sociopolitical meaning of the sacraments, the agapic model, which highlights love and charity, and finally, the theology of the people, based on the popular Latin American wisdom. This later model has been identified as one of Francis' primary influences, insofar as it shifts beyond the classical Marxist notion that shapes the first generation of liberation theology, that was centered particularly in the category of class, toward the category of culture as the key of understanding people. For this current, people is not merely a sociological or political category, but a historical and a spiritual subject, bearer of a collective wisdom that emerges from its faith, its traditions, and its sense of justice. This theology does not arise from a grand philosophical system or abstract ideological debates, but from the concrete lives of ordinary people, from their daily faith, gesture of solidarity, and popular religiosity. In 2013, Francis stated, and I quote, "The people is not a logical or a mystical category if it is understood that everything the people does is good or that the people is an angelic category. No. It is a historical and mythical category at the same time. The people is a social and cultural construction with an identity and a common memory." For Francis, the notion of people plays a role in defining and demarcating the political in ethical terms, beyond traditional liberal or institutional forms. The people is not the sum of individuals, but a community of shared project. Any attempt to eliminate this concept should weaken the meaning of democracy as government of the people, he writes in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti in the section 156. The political dimension of the people lies in the recognition of its intrinsic plurality and politicization. The political dimension, of people lies in the recognition. The political dimension of the popular is expressed in this through the service to a common good. This means that for Francis, politics is not primarily about establishing a particular institutional framework, but about creating spaces of articulation among diverse subjects through shared horizons that evolve over time. For this reason, Francis prioritized his work alongside social movements, expressed in several gatherings with social and popular movements, beginning, for example, with the first World Meeting of Popular Movement held in Rome 2014. Furthermore, we could state that for Francis, the notion of people constitutes the core of the political. As he proclaimed in his address to the popular movement in 2015, politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it seeks the common good. We must be convinced that charity needs politics, that politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it seeks the common good. If politics does not look to the common good, it ceases to be politics and becomes a mere administration of power, corruption, domination, and manipulation. For Francis, then, politics is not defined as a merely institutional or procedural exercise, not as an antagonistic dispute between ideologies. When understood from the popular dimension, politics is linked to the struggle for justice and the construction of articulations oriented in the construction of a common good. But Francis also identifies certain elements that oppose to this way of understanding the people and the popular politics. I highlight just three that I consider significant. The first obstacle is the abstraction of technocratic politics, where political action becomes a mechanism without humanity. Second, the subordination to certain essentialist liberal perspectives that prioritize the individual over the collective. And he says, the concept of people which incorporate a positive value of community and cultural bonds is usually rejected by individualistic liberal visions where society is considered a mere sum of interests that coexist. They speak of respect for freedom, but without shared narrative that sustain it. And finally, the negative understanding of populism. And he also said, populism is not the same as being close to the people. Populism is a negative sense, populism in a negative sense instrumentalizes the people, turning them into a mass. What is truly popular, on the other hand, is born of the people, of their culture, their stories, and their identity. This notion of people also has an intrinsic theological dimension. The people is not an anonymous mass, nor a mere object of evangelization. It is a subject of faith, the protagonist of its own history, a bearer of a spiritual wisdom. In his words, the holy, faithful people of God is infallible in credendo, meaning it possesses an intrinsic instinctive of faith that keeps it united to God even in times of trial. The people is a place of revelation. As Francis affirmed in a 2018 homily, God dwells among his people, not in elites, not in small groups, but in the people who walk patiently with God. To speak of the people and the popular requires acknowledging their intrinsic openness, born of relational, compassionate, and solidarity-based nature, which understand the manifestation of God through hope as a movement that propels us toward a shared struggle. Here is where hope becomes a constitutive element of the people, as a locus where hope itself becomes an impulse, a movement, a constitutive aspect of God as of ever otherness, as radical alterity, as utopian horizon. In summary, the notion of people in Francis implies on the one hand a reframing of the political sphere, including a re-examination of fundamental categories such as democracy, freedom, and equality, by understanding the political as a space of collective construction grounded in relationship of justice, marked by the disruptive presence of the other, and guided by the primary objective of establishing common goods with all the struggles and disagreement that it implies. On the other hand, the people and the popular are understood as inherently theological places where the divine is manifested not through a single discourse, but through a communal discursive space that emerged from shared experiences of faith. In this sense, the divine cannot be understood outside an intrinsically political hermeneutic, shaped by the same elements that give rise to the popular. It is its relational dimension, the agape, its origin in the recognition of constitutive difference that promotes hospitality through solidarity, the kenosis, its collective and communal nature, the ecclesia, solidarity as a core of relationship, the charis, the transformative dynamism of the popular, the kairos, and the hope as an horizon of struggle and utopia, the eschaton. Something very important at this point, it doesn't mean to romanticizing the people. Rather, it is a category that allowed us to grasp the complexity of social processes politically, while also interpreting their dynamics theologically in order to recover their religious and spiritual roots as alternative pathways of generating shared horizons beyond the limits of traditional politics. It means understanding the people as a political signifier and the popular as a field of advocacy grounded as a specific political logic, rather than treating them as identities or a moral, ideological fixed essence. To conclude, I believe that in the current context of democratic crisis we are facing, recovering the political and theological value of the people as developed by Pope Francis is essential. In the face of dehumanization, hatred, and exclusion, fueled by an individualistic, meritocratic, colonial, and exclusionary anthropology inherent from modernity and neoliberalism, we must reclaim compassion and a solidarity-based openness toward the other as guiding principle of our collective construction. Confronted with the crisis of liberal political institutionalism, today instrumentalized by discourses of hatred and destructive mechanisms we once believed to be overcome, we need a politics rooted in the grassroots, based on collective pursuits and constructions of what is in common, conceived as a real horizon, yet open in its eschatological sensitivity. In the face of polarization and fragmentation that turn politics into a minefield of dispute is over self-serving legitimacy. We need a redefinition of the political as a projection toward common horizons that recognize the threat that lurks, the fragility that constitutes us, and the potential that dwells, like the gospel, in our bones. Finally, faced with the weaponizing of a violent image of God, we need a new theological sensitivity that allowed us to understand that there are only divine revelation and manifestation through radical openness to others based on the values of difference, hospitality, and loving welcome, which constitute the core of God's incarnational history. Thank you.
All right, friends, so now we will have like about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to invite Dr. Claudio and Dr. Heather. Sorry, I'm calling you by first names. And we will welcome your questions. Please try to synthesize your questions. I know that we want to. Do I have any questions?
I do have a question.
Yes.
I don't know if you know that, but one thing that intrigues me in Pope Francis is the theology of people that you develop, but which comes from liberation theology. It's kind of a pastoral application of the Conferencia de Medellín. But can you say a little bit more about how it was developed and how was it so much a part of his ministry?
Well, I mean, yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, theology of the people is not usually, it wasn't usually related to liberation theology, but just in Argentina, actually, in some internal discussions there, but it was more studied and deepening when actually Pope Francis was elected and the study of his life. I think, for example, one of the biggest difference between the theology of the people and some traditional epistemological element of liberation theology, at least the first generation of liberation theology, has to do with as I mentioned, understanding the people as a socioeconomical category on one side, and to the other, understanding it a cultural key. It means giving more emphasis on the relationship and the dynamic of relationship between the people, not just the structure that condition those relationships. So in terms of approaching that cultural element of the people, it means there are other values that come into the discussion to consider what is the people. For example, they are the intrinsic spirituality of the people, recognizing that a different expression of a spirituality that is already present even without being Christians. One thing that I couldn't mention, of course, is that, for example, Rodolfo Kusch, that was a philosopher that Pope Francis was inspired in some of the definitions I gave. He was an anthropologist that actually studied, for example, the conception of the people in the relationship between indigenous people and urban centers in Argentina in this case. So the thing is how what is the exchange of that from different groups that constitute the people. And third, the concept of the people in theology and the theology of the people put more emphasis in the common ground that is possible to construct with the people, that in terms of that is sometimes reluctant to the extremes. That's why, for example, theology of the people wasn't in a moment considered a theology of liberation, because some of the people of the thinkers related to the theology of the people were actually kind of reluctant to the first generations of liberation theology. So saying that, I think that that's the put in practice this political dialogue that Francis all the time developed with different theological groups, with different political groups. So for him, the importance was to create justice, relationship of justice among the people, and if for that is necessary to put aside some of the ideological extremes or the theological extreme, let's do that, because it's more important the way of we construct relationship of justice and love. And I think that was an element all the time present in, not just in the words of Francis, but at least in his practice. And that's why I started with this relation of his paradoxical figure and the concept of people, because as the theology of the people says, there is no one definition of the people. To be part of the people is to take a paradoxical position, because be part of the people it doesn't mean that you don't have a specific place, but that place just it doesn't count as the first place when you relate with the other.
Friend over here?
So I think
Okay.
it seems that solidarity has been one of the big themes of the night in all of your talks. Thank you so much for that. Could one of you kind of provide a definition of what solidarity means from a theological perspective, and or speak to the church or the Christian's role in solidarity as an act?
I think using Pope Francis' sense of being with the people, I think solidarity means being with. And being with is to become compañeros de compañeras, which means company, right, with bread. And in that sense is the, it translates into being with, is to love someone to the point that you walk with, that you stay with. And in that, and I think that's one of the gifts of liberation theology is to decide with whom you're going to be in solidarity with. You can, in some ways, you're in solidarity with everybody, but if you do that, you're in solidarity with nobody. And so when there is the preferential option for the poor in liberation theology, we are saying that there are some places where solidarity must happen, to the point of if that doesn't happen, it is destroyed. It is, so if you talk about power now, and we see to be in solidarity is to be with, which means to be in danger also with somebody, right? It's to put your body in the line, on the line with others. So in that regard, solidarity can be a very dangerous thing, that you have to think twice if you actually want to be in solidarity or not, because you can run the risk of losing your own life. So I think that's the radical demand of liberation theology, to be with. And then once you do that, you have to stay there and linger there and walk along with them. To the point of engaging all of the paradoxes and contradictions that it comes with it. For instance, one example is like, oh no, I think I've talked too much already.
Any other questions? Well, one here, and then Dr. Barret, or one of the, or easy. Okay.
Friendship conditional? And I just wanted to
This goes beyond what I presented, so thank you for bringing me back to that. I think that there's a way in which family, in some ways, is operating without a sense of choice, whereas friendship brings agency and choice into his thinking in a certain way. So we're all sort of born family, but then there's a choice to pursue a relationship of friendship in a certain way, and I think that with that sense of choice, who are you in solidarity with and when, there's also the possibility of coming back from that. And so that's where, in some ways, I think his vision of friendship, that friendship can't stand alone, it needs family, and family isn't sufficient, it needs friendship, which is why I think he doesn't define each neatly, and often he's putting them in tandem in order to sort of speak to that. And so I think that that's really the part of friendship that he's concerned about, that you can end a friendship and you can walk away and you're no longer in relationship with someone else.
Easy, and then Ricardo.
So yeah, my question is like in regard to the eschaton, right? When I think of the like eschaton and eschatology, like I think of this like way that the world should be, right? And it's not just this future-oriented kind of reality, but how do we essentially think of eschatology as this better world, but take that as a reference and apply that to here and now today, right? So like my kind of like I had a bit of like this knee-jerk reaction when I saw like one of the slides that said like hope as horizon of struggle and utopia. And my fear sometimes is when we think of the eschaton and how the world should look like here now and today, that this word struggle, right, could be a bit loaded. And I struggle with the word struggle, right? Because sometimes it can entail, not always, but it can entail like violence, right? So like does the theology of the people in regard to the eschaton welcome like some forms of resistance that will liberate people or help people out that must include violence?
Yeah, that's, I know. That's why I took it. Yes. There is a difference between violence and conflict in terms of, and I think that's a key element of understanding that dimension, the eschatological dimension of the people. To talk about conflict is to talk about the inherent disagreement in being a collective. There is no possibility of having actually a community without the acceptance of struggle, discussions, disagreements, that actually it is not necessary to become violence. Actually, we can maybe think of the logic of violence related to polarization and the conflict and disagreement in the construction of the collective. So that would be absolutely two different logics. And actually, I believe that one of the most important problems we have today is that we don't know how to approach conflict to be in a collective. And actually, that is in the impossibility of approaching the inherent conflict of being a collective, when violence becomes. Because I cannot actually deal with the other, deal with the different, so I have to destroy it. And actually, that is why we need to think, or we have the possibility from faith and from theology to think about this eschatologically, because we have an horizon there, we have an utopia. So it's not just the struggle for the struggle, it's not the conflict for the conflict, it's the conflict that is inherent in a construction of a common good. And that was an invitation, I think, of Pope Francis.
And just to add one thing to the notion of eschaton, that I think there's this Brazilian author called Ayrton Krenak that says that when you think about the future is ancestral in that way, that it's not an end of something, right? It's the the eschaton is past, present, and future all together, right? But how do we save ourselves from what's happening? Right? We are living in a climate change that is pretty much is taking us to the end of the eschaton, right? That shouldn't need to be. So how do we then think about the ways in which the ancestral knowledge can be not a repetition of it itself, but unfolding into our present and future, so that there's a possibility of the future. So in that way, I think that notion of the future is ancestral. I love how one indigenous group understandings their life as a way of paying attention to 7 generations, the 3 before us, the 1 that we're living in, the 3 after us. So that is the eschaton in some ways. And so in that way, there is a sense of replenishing, reflourishing our lives. And if you think only in terms of a matter, future, or in a sense that theology loses the presence of the interspecies, that loses the presence of the earth, then we are completely lost.
Ricardo, and then Raimundo.
I just finished today reading this book about the Palestinian people, resistance. You talk about fraternity and friendship as an important teaching for Pope Francis. And you were talking about the Pope Francisco spirituality of the people. And you challenge us today in the chat to be with the people. And we are living in time of genocide. Very evident. It happened in many other places, not only in Palestine. So, my question is, how the Pope Francis stand about the Palestinians, and how his teaching of what you just said about him will challenge us to be with the people that are suffering genocide.
That's an important question. Thank you for bringing that into the room. I think Pope Francis in particular, and Pope Leo is continuing this. We talked about solidarity in the singular before, but I think what does it mean to be in solidarities? And what does it mean to sort of see certain things and be with people, name things, say things to your friends that maybe somebody else can't say to you? And so I would say that that Pope Francis in particular was very clear about his solidarity with the Palestinian people, called every day to one church in Gaza in particular, a Catholic church, every day he called. When he died in his estate, the papal, the sort of bulletproof papal, the Pope Mobile is what we called it when I was a kid, was given to the Palestinians of Gaza in order to transport children through the sort of IDF corridors in order to get to medical care. And so I think that his sort of solidarity with the people of Gaza was well known. Also challenged his solidarity and relationship with different members of the Jewish community. Again, there's Jewish communities around this topic in particular, and I think that diversity needs to be named explicitly as well. And I would say that it was an example of being in friendships, in real relationships with 2 warring communities and trying to hold on to those relationships, but also speaking honestly and truthfully about his experiences.
Raimundo, the microphone. It's okay.
I want to expand the conversation on solidarity because I think Claudio touched on that. One of the important contributions of Pope Francis was his ecological turn. So he talked about ecological conversion. He talked in Querida Amazônia about an ecological dream. In Laudato Si, he inspired by Leonardo Boff connects the cry of the earth with the cry for the poor with the cry of the earth. And he talks about the interconnectedness of everything. And in Querida Amazônia, he even goes as far as acknowledging the value of the wisdom of the indigenous peoples of the Amazon in its own right. So I think there is even an interfaith aspect to it, which is amazing to see in an official document from a Pope. So I would like just for the three of you, if you could expand on this dimension of solidarity that's so important, so present in his work.
Now, we just say that, I mean, of course, the ecological approach of Francis, it wasn't just like a very important, and we know very well in sometimes reluctant issue within Christian theology, but it's something that, for me, I mean, reading, for example, Laudato Si and other declarations of Pope Francis and so on, is that he didn't just take for example, thinking about the environment and thinking about the dialogue with indigenous groups, just some pragmatic action in terms of me as a Pope going to them or talking about. I mean, he took. I think he took seriously about how we have to understand the most basic things in terms of Christian faith, or faith itself, of God even, from that dialogue. How we have to change our theology from thinking about the environment. So something that I was always, that I always saw in Pope Francis was that he took these issues not just theologically in terms of issues, not just methodologically, if not epistemologically. So he took all these issues to rethink theology, to rethink faith, to rethink the interreligious encounter and so on. So I think in that, specifically reading Laudato Si, we can see that all the shifts, that the epistemological shifts he proposed approaching these issues.
Yeah, I would just affirm and build off of that. I think the epistemic part of all of this is pretty radical and is something that it'll be interesting to see if and how Pope Leo continues in that trajectory, because the idea of the church listening, really listening, and then changing is not a sort of a typical posture with regards to all of this, and that's something I think we should keep our eye on.
Sorry, no, just to add, sorry, Claudia. I know you wanna. I just remembered I was in a conference in Chile last year with a group of Argentinian and Chilean, well, Latin American theologians in general, but it was a group of Argentinians working with theologians in Bolivia from the Pan-Amazon. It was like a work group of the Pan-Amazon Synod. And actually, it was really interesting to see how they were thinking very deeply about it. A lot of discussion and conflicts in how we can change our traditional hermeneutics of the Bible. That was for example, one of the big discussions, and it was interesting for me to see how, again, this specific approach for the Pan-Amazon Synod impulse to a really deep discussion and a critique to the traditional ways of reading the Bible, specific in the Catholic groups in South America.
There were two years of conversation among several organizations in the Amazon leading to the Pope's response.
The Amazonics, the Synod, right? The Synod of the Amazon, which was this fantastic, very expensive ways of engage. But what I think, all of this, and you already said it, that I would just testify to what you said, is I think with Laudato Si, we gained language. Pope Francis gave us theological language. What did we have that was so popular in terms of the ecological discourse? We had to go back to St. Francis in the 13th century. And if you ask, so what is the other theologian, what is the other document about ecology? Very little people, few people will know. I think what he gave us is this immense theological language he gave, to speak. And so in that way, he gave us theological grammar to start a different form of conversation that open up for a vast majority of fields, not only with those that you mentioned, but for instance, I was part of a conversation with the Museum of Anthropology in Rio de Janeiro, and we had one of the most important anthropologists of our time, Eduardo Vieira de Castro, engaging with Laudato Si, which would be never thought in terms of other disciplines to find ways of engaging. So what do we do with it? Because this, everybody's hands must be on the deck. And so what I think he gave us a larger deck so that we all could put our hands on and say, okay, we need finances, we need economy, we need anthropology, we need religion to figure this out. And so I think that is the vastness of solidarity, that he created the possibility of unimaginable numbers and forms and ways of creating solidarity from the land, with the land, to the land. And Querida Amazonia is I think, is the Laudato Si in a nutshell. How do you do that locally with this one bioregion, with one piece of land? Again, language that comes from this very large sense to very specific. I think that's what is this contribution.
All right, thank you so much to our lecturers, preacher, lecturer, panelists. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that you enjoyed it. This concludes our Herencia Lectures 2025, and we're already working on 2026. So, and the Mujerista Symposium that is going to happen in April is going to be Dr. Yara Gonzalez Justiniano. So Yara Gonzalez is going to be the lecturer, and Kenya Vanessa Mendoza is going to be responding to the lecture, and then we're going to have some of our Latina students who are going to be also part of the panelists, because that's what we do in that lecture, that we bring scholars and also our students who respond and they participate, and we have a great conversation, all Latina theologians. So thank you so much. You all have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for coming. God bless.